This video tutorial is on what is a spreadsheet. We will look at the definition of a spreadsheet as well as what we use spreadsheets for, and we'll also look at some terminology that gets used in spreadsheet applications. So what exactly is a spreadsheet? Well, a spreadsheet is an electronic document, and what's special about a spreadsheet is we have two-dimensional data in rows and columns. In a spreadsheet, we can actually store data. So in these cells, we can stick values, we can stick letters, and we can also manipulate that data as well. So we can add all of these numbers together by using a function and perform calculations on that data. So what I've just done here is I've summed up the values between cell B3 and cell B6. So typically in the past, spreadsheets have been used mainly for numerical data, so numbers, but more recently they've been used also to store text values as well and being able to manipulate those. So just like we can have multiple word processing applications, so we have Microsoft Word and Google Docs, we can also have multiple spreadsheet applications. So this is obviously Google Sheets, but we can also use Microsoft Excel. And all of the skills that you'll learn in Google Sheets are pretty much all directly transferable to Microsoft Excel. So you could open up the program Excel and use it almost straight away. So what exactly do we use spreadsheets for? As I mentioned before, we use spreadsheets to store data, and we also use it to manipulate data and perform calculations. We can also use the data inside and being able to visualize that data in lots of different ways. So through charts and through conditional formatting. So it allows us to actually then use that data in a meaningful manner too. So we're just going to introduce some terminology here. So I've mentioned a few of these words already, but what we've got here, these vertical slots of information, we call those columns, and a column is represented by a capital letter, and in this instance this is column D here. We also have here rows, and rows are horizontal slots of data, and rows are represented by a number from an integer. So in this instance this is row 5, and then if we combine those two together, we get a D and a 5. This rectangle here can store a piece of information here, and we call this rectangle a cell. And we reference cells by using the column letter and the row number. So this the cell reference of this particular cell is cell D5, and we also term the thing that's inside the cell is data, but we typically call that the value of that cell. So we've got columns and we've got rows, and when those columns and rows intersect, we get cells. We can also have a range, and so a range is one-to-many cells in a collection next to each other, so they need to be adjacent. And so here we have a function that uses a range in here. So this function is the sum function, and it calculates if we added all the values in this range together, it will return that value. So we've got a range here B3 to B6. So we start off in cell B3 and we end in B6. And so this range is represented by the first cell, B3, or the reference of the first cell, B3, 2 using the colon, which is the 2 dots, and our last cell, which is B6. we've got the cell reference of that. So B3 to B6. And as I said, this function in particular adds those values in that range. So it's going to add 1, 2, 6, and 3 together. And when we press enter, it gives us the value there, 12. So that's a range. We also have what are called worksheets. So worksheets are these tabs down the bottom, and they represent different grids of information. So here we are in the working area worksheet, and if I click here, I'm now in the data worksheet, and you'll notice that the information on that page has changed. And we can have many different worksheets, and we store those within a single workbook. So this workbook is the IT Department Budget 2017 workbook, and in there we have 2 worksheets. And we can add another one by clicking on this add sheet, and by default it gives us a standard name, and we can change this to whatever we like. Okay. The last piece of terminology I'd like to use is the formula bar. So the formula bar is represented up here by the f of x, and we can actually write functions and formulas within here. And that's basically where the power of spreadsheets comes from, being able to manipulate that data. So if I go back to my working area worksheet here, and I click on this cell B7, this is the cell that we used a function, and when I click on that cell, even though the value of that cell is 12, it shows me in the formula bar how that value was calculated. So it uses a function which is represented by the equal sign, and that function is called sum, and we use brackets to put in the parameters that we want to pass through to that function. So sum takes a range, and we pass that range through to the function, and the function does its calculations and returns a value here. So that's the basics of spreadsheets. What we will do is we'll start moving on to some simple formulas in the next tutorial.